welcome to everybody who's joined in today to attend today's WishwaTalk on timeless dance cultures, time-bound dancing women. For centuries, India has been home to many dance forms and has inspired everything from art to architecture. In today's talk, we would be delving deeper into the history of dance and its impact on society, the timeless dance cultures and time-bound artists behind them. And it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Professor Swarnamalya Ganesh, dancer, dance historian, educator, with 35 years of experience in this field. Her PhD thesis was on research and reconstruction of lost dance repertoires of early modern South India. In a pioneering effort, she studied in depth the history and sources involved in the lost performing traditions to reconstruct them. From the Attic is a performance lecture exhibition series based on her research. Dr. Ganesh has realigned her practice and teaching of dance as sadar, the subaltern form of Bharatanatyam. She contextualizes her works through gender, society, stigma, and political movements. She's a senior disciple of Guru Kalaimamani K.J. Sarasa, the Tiruvazaputtur Kalyani granddaughters, and Viralimalai Muttukannammal. She has books and article publications to her credit and has produced DVDs of her works. She's also a well-known actor and media person in Indian cinema and television.
A very good evening to everyone who's present here. It is indeed a great pleasure to join you all on the platform of Vishwas and on this Parampara series. I wish to thank the organizers of Vishwas, Mr. Mani and his entire dynamic team, as well as Pramod Reddy, who reached out to me and invited me to be a part of this evening. And I would like to thank Amy for her beautiful introduction. And that's where I would like to begin this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to perhaps jump into the conversation. It's a free-flowing talk in a sense that I'm going to share some interesting corroborations that one can draw from the ways in which one can see the idea of sculpture, dance, women, and time. 4 very interesting operative words. Time. Time is indeed a very, it's a telling marker of human experience. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of why I call it timeless and time-bound. Now, because every time we use the term time in the context of culture, we often speak of it in eternal time, in eternal timelines. We say dance has been here for eternity. Art has been there forever, from time immemorial, so on and so forth. So the idea of time is indeed eternal, cyclic, if you will, and it's timeless. It's extending forever. Deceptive as timeless, one will know that these belong to places. These sculptures are all etched on the walls of temples and the walls of monuments and perhaps lying in a museum somewhere with several timelines embedded on them. Of course, the first being the exact date when the sculpture itself was etched. And then the day the temple was consecrated. Then perhaps a day when the temple was either, it stopped having its religious function, or the date later on when it was moved, some of these sculptures were moved from there into a museum space, or the first time when the first historian or the first traveler encountered these sculptures. So there are several timelines that are embedded on every cultural object that we see. So today I want to talk of sculptures, and I want to talk of women and dancing women, particularly on sculptures. But before I take you into the idea of women and dance, I want to pause at sculpture a little bit. This idea of a physical entity which captures a particular frozen moment, let's say, a freeze, as we will call it. But the idea of experiencing this freeze is timeless, which is why I called it timelessness. Let me try and explain that with a wonderful theory that should make all of us think a little bit, that was put forth by a philosopher named Derrida. Now, Derrida says, experience is conditioned by time. Every experience is conditioned by time. But what happens really is, this time that you are experiencing, I mean, this experience that you're having in time is not an experience of the past or the present, past or the future, but it is in fact the present. So every time somebody encounters sculpture, every time somebody sees a sculpture, every time somebody sees it on the walls or sees it in the museum or sees it as a picture on Google, wherever, or even in this lecture, you are encountering that sculpture, you are experiencing that sculpture. And that experience time is in time, is that moment when you're seeing it that you're experiencing it. But because anytime, anywhere, anyone can have this experience over and over again and again. You can go back and have that experience. You don't know how many pairs of eyes have had that experience in the past, thousands, millions perhaps, from the very time this sculpture was etched. And therefore it's timeless. Because scores of people over so many centuries have laid their eyes on the sculpture. Let's put this in the context of a temple. We'll come to the idea of a museum and all that later. Why do we have sculptures on the temple wall? It's a very interesting concept because yes, a temple was a religious space, but a temple was also a place where people gathered. People gathered to it was the socio-economic epicenter of every kingdom. And there were several such socioeconomic epicenters in every kingdom. I mean, there were large temples, there were state-run temples, there were society-run temples, so on and so forth. But the idea of a temple and filling the walls of those temples with beautiful sculptures. The reason why, I mean, one of the reasons one can think of why these, one will never know, but why these sculptures were etched in fact was perhaps this idea that as you go around the temple, you see these sculptures. You may not see all of them all the time. There might be 1,000 sculptures within a temple. You may see about 100. You may be distracted otherwise. You may be doing other things. You may just look down at the floor as you're walking, whatever it may be. If your eyes are set upon even 5, 10, say 50 sculptures as you're walking around, every time you see them, you have an experience. And that's why these sculptures are probably there, so that it can give the temple goer an experience every time. Not just the experience of the central deity of a temple, but the experience of so many other things that come with encountering objects. And I call a sculpture an object because it is. It is movable. You can take it from one place and put it elsewhere. Right? So many of us have beautiful bronze sculptures, whether they be small or big, in our own homes sometimes. So they are objects, they are cultural objects. But why do we put them there? Not because we found them beautiful once upon a time. It's because we find them beautiful every single time, every single day. And we have an experience with them every time we see them. And so these sculptures in the temples are also meant for the very same reason. Now we'll come from the idea of sculpture more closer to dance sculpture. And then we'll come to the women part, right? So the dance sculpture. Why do we have dance sculptures on temple walls? I mean, the logic is dance is a performing art. It's an art that's in the state of action. It's an art that moves naturally because it's a movement-based art. how can you possibly place dancing sculptures, which is very paradoxical in the way you say that, on temple walls? How can you sculpt dance into a frieze? I've often wondered, because several archaeologists and of course several dance scholars over these years have asked why the artist chooses to, how does an artist or a sculptor choose to find a particular moment when he wants to freeze the sculpture, freeze the movement? If there is a whole movement, say something like this, how does that moment where he wants to freeze? It's a choice, really, because the classic example for such a choice is indeed the Karana sculptures that you find in so many temples strewn across South India. Let us take the example of Tala Pushpaputam, which is the very first Karana, which is etched in the Tanjavur temple, in freeze you at any given moment, so that he can make a frozen moment out of your movement, is the idea of a dance sculpture. But what we forget, though, is this art, which is intrinsically action-oriented, is brought to a state of being through a sculpture. But the state of being is indeed not, over time, over the centuries, over this idea of timelessness, we have perhaps lost the understanding that several of these sculptures are indeed dance. We call them poses. We call them freezes. We call them postures. And we always tend to think that they are the ending or the beginning posture of a movement. I mean, if we agree that it is a movement, then we tend to think that it's the beginning or the end. Because in our minds, we think that the only time a sculptor would have chosen to sculpt a dance movement is either at the beginning of it or at the end. We don't believe that he sees a moment of sculptural excellence in the movement. We don't really think like that. But the truth is, in the beginning, middle, and the end, anywhere, the artist or the sculptor would choose to sculpt away. To me, this idea of a continuous timeline, where the movement again is in motion, because it's never a freeze. The freeze tells you that there is something that's happened before, there is something that's going to happen later, but what you're seeing now is indeed a split moment in that action. And that timelessness of that movement, we have no idea what the Kala Pramana, as we call it, what the time pace of that movement is. We have no idea of what the music of that movement is. We have no idea of the cultural imprints of that movement. We don't know who is doing it. There is a beautiful person there, but we don't know their name. We have no question of, there's no question of identifying them as individuals. So there is a haze between what you see and what exactly is. The only thing that connects you to it is time, which says, hey, this is only a split second. I remember going to the Thap Ram temple in Cambodia and in Angkor, near Angkor Wat. And I was so excited when I went in because I saw the Mukhatorana in the Mukhatorana sculptures, and there were 2-3 friezes, again, incidentally of Tala Pushpaputta, but of different moments. But one was able to connect that. So you walk into the temple and you're taking this circumambulatory space, looking at beautiful sculptures, and you're looking at women. Why only women? Because women are very intrinsically connected to the idea of life itself. I'm saying this because these are the principles, the fundamental philosophies, the hermeneutic ideas on which temples were initiated as places of worship. Even when temples were imagined as places of worship, along with it came the idea of placing the female figure, the dancing female figure, as a very important element in that experience of a temple. I'll tell you why. But before I do that, before I take you into the temple, let me introduce you, or rather reintroduce you to a figure that most of you might be rather familiar with. Textbooks, school textbooks, if you've gone through some of the dominant narratives. This is the dancing girl as she has been described by historians from Mohenjo-daro, the Harappan civilization. Right? She's got one hand on her hip and the other is hanging perhaps in a dola hasta or whatever. One is not able to really see. She's a really tiny figure, right? But it doesn't quite look like a dola hasta if you're able to see. There she is. Now, many of you might be asking, so is she the very first dancer? I mean, is she timeless? Because we don't know her name. But she does belong to the Harappan civilization, so there is a time frame there. But that's not why I put her there. I put her there because this woman, I'm not even going to call her dancer, because people like Namana Huja and more recently Sadan and Menon and others who have taken a counter view to the idea that she could have actually been a dancer, argue that in the 1920s, when they excavated the Harappan civilizational sites, they found her. Right, and they found her and they found it very intriguing, right? So the society was rife with this idea of dancing and dancing women, and they were bringing them in a time-bound moment of discussion about the dancing women. So when they identified this little figurine of a woman from Harappan civilizational archaeological site, they called her a dancer. Is she dancing? We don't know. She's holding one hand on her hip and the other is down, but it looks like she's possibly holding something in her hand, which is hanging down. So one thing is for sure, that this lady, whether she is in a movement of dance or not, is certainly a woman who is holding something in her hand, and she is in a very interesting posture. This is not a moment, this is not as if we will stand every day when in conversation. I don't stand and talk to you like this all the time. Unless I have a particular reason, I won't take a pose like this, right? So she's standing there, almost like ready to be photographed, right? So that's her. But I want to draw your attention to the idea that she's perhaps holding something in her hand. Different people have suggested that she's holding different things, right? But I only want to say that it could be anything, but she's holding something in her hand. We don't know what yet. But what could a woman elsewhere be holding? I want to bring to you, some of you might know, some of you may be new to this idea of the Shalabhanjika. Now, she is a figure who is clearly holding a beautiful tree branch, which is right above her head, and her foot is crossed, almost a swastika, but here it's also raised. And she's wearing beautiful hip ornaments, and she's very beautifully decorated. Here you see the bending creeper of that tree, and you see her in the middle of this natural habitat, holding on. So she's not alone. You will find hundreds of Shalabhanjikas everywhere. Right? So it's very beautiful how one motif runs through several temples. And often people call her, they say, oh, she's the woman with the creeper, the woman who's holding the creeper, she's the woman who's holding the tree branch. She's in a pose of holding a tree. So we always think of it as a pose. But I today want to bring this timeless Shalabhanjika to the imagination of a time-bound dancer. Let's see how. So let us first understand who a Shalabhanjika is. Shala is a kind of tree. And, okay, I'll give you certain, I think, historical and literary references to Shalabhanjika, which will put a little bit of perspective for you. So Bodhisattva stories of the Buddha, right? They have a beautiful legend of Maya Devi, right? Maya Devi, this is from Lama Tanka, right? So in the Lumbini Vana, Maya Devi is supposed to have walked into the garden with some of her friends, and she wanted to hold the Shala tree. When she just wanted to hold it, the tree bent towards her. So just when she was about to go and grab it, unexpectedly, she started to give birth to the Buddha. And so she held on to the branch to take control of herself, and she crossed her legs. How can a person give birth in that position? Well, she did in most of our literary works, right? So it is in that moment that because of her pressure, the branch broke. It bhanjaka, so it broke. And so the Shala Bhanja is in fact the broken Shala branch, right? But she's holding on to it. So this very posture, I mean, here you will see how beautifully this entire scenery is depicted. It's all in the middle of nature. Now, why nature, right? Because the idea of maybe perhaps because of the Maya Devi story, or because of the philosophical and the sort of hermeneutic idea behind women connected deeply to nature and therefore fertility, the idea of procreation and fertility, and nature having a tremendous role to play in bringing forth this idea of fertility. Right? This is a running concept that you find in Shalabhanja everywhere. But of course, Maya Devi's story is in fact a very compelling imagery for us, right? The swastika leg and the holding of the tree. Please remember that, okay? Holding her hand up. Okay, this is a motif that will remain. We don't have to remember it too much. All you have to do is walk into any temple and you will probably see one or two Shalabhanjas, definitely. Right? But it's not just on temple walls that you see Shalabhanjas. Like I said, in monasteries, you will see Shalabhanja. You will see it in Jaina literatures. You will see it in Prabodha Chandrodaya kind of Sanskritic literatures, Krishna Mishra, right? For Kirtivarman, he wrote this Prabodha Chandrodaya. He mentions, Nati Shastra mentions Shalabhanjika. Everywhere she's holding to something. Everywhere she's holding on to something. And that something very often is a tree or a branch or a flower or a fruit or later on other articles. We will come to all that a little bit later. Just now, actually. Here. So here is another Shalabhanja. By the way, because we don't have too much time, I am not chronologically going in any particular chronological order in these images. I'm using these images more to show you the form and what is there. And so I'm also taking you through different periods. I'm sort of going back and forth. So forgive me, we don't have the time to do everything today, right? But please concentrate on the beautiful, beautiful images. Look at her. She's standing rather gracefully. And one hand is up, you know, near her forehead, but she's in fact holding a mirror. Right? So she's also a Shalabhanja, by the way. How can you say, but I thought Shala is the branch, is the tree, and so only woman who holds a Shala tree should be Shalabhanjika? No, as time rolls, for example, in Shiva Purana, a Shalabhanjika is someone who holds a lamp in her hand. And how many temples have we come across women holding a lamp? In Tamil Nadu, we call her Pavai Vilakku. Right? Women, there are many other legends, many other legends to each one of these images. But what I want to concentrate here is, these are not just friezes. These are friezes of a moment within a movement. So what happened before, what happened after is in fact the dance, but she is sculpted in that one moment where she's holding a mirror and she's standing with a Lalata Tilaka. Naishada Charitra of Sri Harsha of the 12th century again talks of Vishalabhanjika. But here, Now he gives us a little bit of a clue. He says she is Bahurupaka Shalabhanjika, which means she can take many forms. So now you know why you can have the mirror, you can have the flower, you can have the tree, you can have the plant, you can hold a fruit, you can hold a parrot. But you're not just holding all of these articles. It's not like as if you're holding them and you're modeling. The idea of all of these articles being representative or symbolic of a woman's connection to nature, connection to fertility, connection to auspiciousness, connection to the temple, and the experience that the devotee will have as you're circumambulating the temple, is indeed a very, very strong image. Now I want to introduce you to another idea within the Shalabhanjika, which is very close to Shalabhanjika, but is not the Shalabhanjika, which is called the Dohada. Now, Dohada is a very, very interesting concept again. You find it in, I will also tell you this, it's very interesting. The Shalabhanjika is not a sculpture. I mean, it's not a frozen sculpture. It's not an iconography. It is a dance sculpture. Why am I saying that with so much conviction? Because the iconographic content, the iconographic elements of Shalabhanjika are not found in any of the Shilpa Shastra texts, but it's found in all the literary texts and all the performative texts, and including Natya Shastra. In the second chapter of the Natya Shastra, he talks about how we must decorate the Natya Mandapa with Shalabhanjika. Right? So there is some truth or perhaps some weightage to the idea that she is in fact connected to the performative art rather than just an iconography, a frozen moment. So we come back to Dohada. Right? So in Dohada is another beautiful concept, literary performative concept. What is the performance of Dohada? Dohada literally means a tree expectant in anticipation of pregnancy, simply put, right? Which means that the tree is looking to blossom any moment. That's what it means, but it's just so beautifully, and poetic that, when you say it's expecting to be pregnant, become pregnant, right? So which means that the tree wants to flower, it wants to blossom. It's also connected to the idea of fertility, right? So here, again, I'll take you back to maybe one of Kalidasa's references to the Dohada. And in Malarikagni Mitram, Kalidasa talks about a beautiful image. The heroine is readying herself to perform the Ashoka Dohada. What's the Ashoka Dohada? The Ashoka tree wants to blossom. If the Ashoka tree wants to blossom in today's world and age, we would think, let us put some manure, let's make sure that there's enough water, there is enough sunlight, make sure it's well taken care of, and we allow it to blossom. But you also will see that even in villages till today, when they want to plant a tree, they usually ask the woman to come and do it. And we might wonder, I mean, it rather a bit patriarchal to think that women alone will have this sort of bestowing of that privilege. But indeed, because for a long number of years, all cultures believed in the power of the female. It's closely connected to the power of fertility. And it is true. Women are the only ones who can give birth. The Ashoka Dohada is where the woman, the heroine, will paint her feet in red. Please conjure up all the beautiful dance images wearing the alta on your feet, right? Beautifully painting your feet in red, stepping out and going away and kicking your left foot. Oh, by the way, your feet is painted in red and you're also wearing nupura. You have to wear ankle. So the salangai or the nupura is very, very important. You wear it, you step out, you wear beautiful clothes, of course. The kacha and all of the other beautiful ornamentation which is here, which I can't go into details now, but another day perhaps. And then you come in, cross the foot. A beautiful article written by Devangana Desai. She brings an interesting idea. She says the Natya Shastra's Ashwakranta Karana or the Ashwakranta Chari Now, the Ashwakranta is a very telling, self-explanatory term. You would say Ashwa meaning horse, Kranta is, holding the reins. So you are literally jumping on top of the horse. So, it rather feels rather masculine, or sorry, I shouldn't be assigning these gendered notions to terms, but it rather feels like a very action-oriented martial movement, where your hands and your legs are in the chatura position, and you are, one leg is placed flat and the other leg is raised. But in fact, Ashwakranta Karana is, or the Ashwakranta position is connected to the Ashoka Dohata rather, where it's almost as if the woman is climbing on top of the horse, but even as she has to climb, she has to hold on to the Ashoka tree. And so, you're touch with the tree. This idea of this timelessness of this cycle of fertility, and how you will touch an object and you hold on to an object and your feet and your hands will move. All of this is purely performative. And so she can be a Shalabhanjika, she can also be an Ashoka Dohada holding this beautiful flower in her hand. And she can be in the Mughal paintings, she can be in the Dhakkani paintings, she can really be anywhere. There she is. Right, so let's do Maya Devi here. Look at this from the monastery in Lama Tanka. This is her, the Shalabhanjika, but in Lalata Tilaka, holding the mirror with a darpana. And here is she holding a flower, Ashoka Dohada. Right, but of course, I mean, the Mughals didn't call her Ashoka Dohada, but she was indeed a beautiful, a Mughal influenced painting. She's holding, in fact, a fly whisk in one hand and a beautiful flower in the other. But look, and her feet are painted red, or she's wearing a beautiful red pair of jutis. Here again, I'm bringing you back to the Shalabhanjika. She's in the open, she's with nature, there are trees above her, her hands are up. How many images of dancers and dance have you seen in temples where the hands are up, right? The hands are held up, right? With her feet crossed in swastika. The times that you have, the many scores of times that you have seen these, the timelessness of it all, and always thought, oh, what a beautiful pose, what a beautiful picture. My friend, it's not a pose. It is indeed a movement. You've caught her in the middle of it, somewhere in the middle of it, or in the end of it, perhaps. Right? She's just holding on to it. So it is, the Shalabhanja is in fact movement. And here is the Vijayanagara mural. Here, I mean, of course, the center is Kali and Artana, but on the right and left, you see the beautiful arched creeper that the women are holding. Why do you have these images? Why should a woman hold something in her hand? And why should that be a creeper or something to do with nature, something to do with alankara, something to do with beauty? Is it because it was frivolous? Not at all. Was it innocuous? Not at all. There is something very interesting about why these images are. Right, and then I bring you from the timelessness, now I'll bring you into the time-boundness. But between timeless and time-bound is this transitory moment of transition, really, not transitory, but transition, where the timeless sculptures are now frozen, and you've forgotten. When I say you, history, people of the past perhaps, are slowly losing this connection between the living dance on that sculpture, and they're seeing them as just images on the walls of temples. They're saying, wow, it's so beautiful. The British come in, the foreigners come in, they are seeing scores of temples with n number of dancing images of dancers and women. They're saying these are also timeless. I mean, they're from the 10th century, 12th century, 1st century, all of the beautiful monastery and temple and Buddhist and Jaina monuments have the Shalabhanja. All the way until Nayaka and Maratha even. here in the South. And then they start seeing the flesh and blood artists within the same places, the same temples where, the experience, as Derrida said, the experience is looking at these sculptures. It's in the moment. They also get to encounter the physical experience of watching a flesh and blood woman dance in front of them, inside the very same temples. What she's doing and what the sculpture is perhaps are very different because she's dressed very differently. The sculpture has no music behind it. It has no context to it. You are not able to imagine the sequence of that art. But here she is moving. She's dancing. There is color, there is light, there is all of that. And then, of course, the entire social construct around the female dancer inside a temple or inside any monument. Just captivated by her, the painters, let's say, some of the Orientalist paintings that started emerging looked something like this. But here I want you to observe, what is the woman dancer doing? She's flesh and blood. We don't know her name yet. That's why I said it's a moment of transition. She's still far away for us. She's much like the sculpture, except she's not a sculpture. We know she was real. She lived sometime in time. She was not frozen on the wall. She was time bound. But look at her hands. They are held together and above her head. And she is in the open, right? So she's holding her hand above. The holding of the hand above your head is something that we think, we don't ask where these movements are coming from. We don't ask how movements have emerged. We only know that movements have evolved and emerged, and we understand them pedagogically, but we don't understand them in their sort of multidisciplinary way. But I'm very interested in that journey. So look at this hand. Look at her stance. How did that stance come about in the physical form of a real dancer? Look at that. And I'm also going to remind you that she doesn't just strike a pose like this. South Indian dancers, South Indian, even those of us who are doing other forms of dance from other parts of India, you might be very familiar with the idea of an aradi, the flourish in the end, where often we do ta tajam, ta tajam, ta tajam. Right? So you have to take the hand up. So you end there, but that is not the aradi. The aradi is actually tat tajam, tat tajam. There is a movement to it. So the flesh and blood, the time boundness of that. Tat tajam is within a Kala Pramana cycle. Tat tajam done by a particular dancer is done in the 14th, 15th, 18th, 20th century. It is done by Kamala, it is done by Rajalakshmi, it is done by Navanitam, it is done by women whose faces, names, and bodies and voices we know of. And then we know that the Shalabhanjika is not just frozen on the temple wall, but she's actually doing tat tajam, tat tajam, tat tajam. She is Nitya Sumangali, so she is fertility. She is associated with the idea of fertility, the idea of being very auspicious. So she is performing the Ashoka Dohada by touching. She touches very important articles in the temple so that they are pure and they are ritualized in a manner because of her fertility and purity. And then she's performing tat tajam with her hand held up. I'm bringing you to a much closer time. Of course, I'm taking you back to a sculptural form, but because I said they are time bound because also we did not know her name. We don't know her name particularly, at least I don't know her name particularly. With a little bit more research and help, one might be able to find her name. So she is also time bound in that sense. But this lady here, who is clearly a Shalabhanjika, holding her hand up in a movement, holding something, Her name is in fact etched above. There is an inscription in the Sivayam temple where her name, her actual name, we don't, how many beautiful Shalabhanjikas have we seen across the Gupta, Maurya, Ashoka periods without a name? We don't know who is that beautiful lady who is holding that creeper and dancing. Here we have a name. This is a Nayaka period sculpture. We also have the Nattuvanar. I mean, this is a single pillar. Her figure is on the right-hand side. He is here. His name is Nagama Nattuvan. I'm sorry, this is a little upturn, but also you are also privy to the vandalism. Somebody happily painting their own initials on top of a timeless sculpture of another Devadasi of the Nayaka period. Her name is Mani. Right. So was she always alone? Was the Shalabhanjika always alone? Was the dancer, was the timeless Shalabhanjika and the time-bound Devadasis who are dancing, were they always depicted alone in this sort of lonely Virahatapa stance, where, your hands are up, held? It naturally brings a certain sort of solitude to your position. You also find beautiful decorative panels like this, where they are dancing together. So these are not, what I mean to say is none of these. Now you might look at this and say, two women holding their hands and standing in a dance posture. This is what we would say. But this is not dance posture. This is dance itself. People were dancing like this. This is a moment in a movement. When you see this frieze, when you see this photograph, what you see is a photograph, a moment. But before this, they would have come together. After this, they're going to twirl, and then they will come back to doing some other movement. So there is a continuity of this movement. And there again, the Devadasi woman in all her splendor, in the open, in the bower. She's not just within the temple confines or just within monasteries, but she's also on the beautiful, she's also imagined to dance in parks and imagined to dance in social functions, until she was taken and time-boundly crushed and brought into the proscenium stage, where you have harsh artificial lights and a stage that separates her and you from all the natural surroundings. Just like the temple, here you have the beautiful garden where there is creepers around her, there are natural trees, and she's holding her hand up. All movements. Will you ever look at this photograph and say, no, she was posing? She was not posing. So every sculpture that you see like this, holding a tree, or just holding a hand, or holding a mirror, or holding a parrot, and then every photograph of a Devadasi, these are all memories of movement, memories of dancing women. I know that I will be leaving a lot of thought provocation here rather than answers. But the idea here is these are vast experiential topics that requires for you to circumambulate, go around looking for these pictures, either in the physical world in a temple or in the digital world. Today, you can circumambulate any temple on the digital space, any monastery, any monument, really, right? So the idea that these are all experiences that you will have in a time relationship. So you as a viewer, you have a great role to play. You have a very important role to play. If you go past them, calling them just poses or calling them just friezes, you have missed a great opportunity to see the movement in them. The Ashoka Dohada, by the way, I must tell you, is also symbolic of the idea that a tree will flower the minute it listens to music, or the minute it has the graceful touch of music, of a performer. Right? There are several trees that are supposed to flower the minute they listen to music. The Ragamala series will tell you about so many of those kinds of trees. So music and art and performance within the temple is not just ritualistic, but it's also meant to stimulate the sensory and experiential life of a devotee every single time. So every time you go pradakshina around the temple, you have to, every time you see the Shalabhanja, you will have a new experience. You will have an experience of the dance. So you will, in your mind's eye, you should be able to see the full dance. And that one moment when that sculptor has caught that as a freeze, as opposed to just seeing it as sculptures. But then if you see it as sculptures, you will just walk past them. So friends, I want to conclude by saying that the timelessness of dance sculptures is enmeshed in the social, cultural, economic, and political existence of the time-bound dancing women. They are called Devadasis now, but they were called with different names at different times. Either way, they were women who were celebrated often for the same kinds of values that we attach to the Shalabhanjika: fertility, eternal prosperity, procreation, so on and so forth. And her art is, even today, the aradi that a Bharatanatyam dancer will do on any stage is still reflective of the timeless. The time-bound aradi is reflective of the timeless Shalabhanja. So I will leave you all with more thoughts and questions there. And let's hope that we have a fruitful discussion. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, that was absolutely phenomenal. There's a certain glow that comes across your face when you talk about it. So it's inspiring, it's contagious, the passion and the drive that you have. Thank you so much. There are a few questions. I will let Amy ask you and take you through those questions.
I have a few questions, ma'am. I would just dive into them immediately. So the first one we have out here is, who are those people that sculpted those figures? Can you talk a little about the geopolitical scenario of the time and what society meaning did these have?
Right, that's several questions. So who are what's the first part of the question?
Who are those people that sculpted those figures?
Right. So as you might know, the Vishwakarma community, or the community of sculptors, of course, just as society was divided into several occupational communities, the Vishwakarma community, or people who connect, who trace themselves to the Vishwakarma community, are indeed the sculptors, the stapatis as we call them here, and the asaris if they are doing other bronze and other sort of ornamental sculptures in metal, right? So they were the ones who were sculpting all of these from different, sometimes in certain temples, in certain contexts, we get their names, but in several others we don't. But suffice to say that as far as sculptures are concerned, almost always it would have been people from the community of sculptors. But when it comes to paintings, murals and paintings, it could be many people. For example, Fazan Ali, right, who was one of the very important Dakhini painters, has done so many Shalabhanjikas, right? And he's used them as motifs to sort of splatter around on his larger canvases of Bijapur and Golconda and all of these other places where he was moving between. So, so there were also other people from other cultures and painters, also Hindu painters, who were really experimenting with the idea of the Shalabhanjika. She's also not exclusive, like I said, to India. She's also Pan-Asian. So you will see the idea of the Shalabhanja in, of course, in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia and many other parts. So many people. What's the second part of the question, please?
Your views on the geopolitical scenario of the time.
So the geopolitical scenario is, again, it's a very deep question. Like I said, there was a reason why I left that argument out because we don't have the time, because each of these sculptures are drawn from different, like I said, the chronology is also a little mixed up in the way I showed it to you today. Like I said, it could be from, I've taken one from the Gupta age, I've taken one from Sarnath, I've taken, I think, one from, of course, the Vijayanagara, one from Dhakkani region, one from the Mughal painting. So interestingly, if I should comment on the geopolitical scenario of any one place, I would like to think of the medieval, late medieval, early modern time, where in the transitioning moment of the Shalabhanjika losing her ritualistic understanding, and she was becoming a literary and a aesthetic motive. That's a very important moment for us, right? Where she was beginning to be seen as not a dancer, as definitely not a ritualistic, with any ritualistic role within a temple, but often as decorative. Of course, Natya Shastra also calls her a decorative figure, right? She's supposed to be at the plinth of the Rangapita. But that aside, she definitely at the time of the Natya Shastra, which in my opinion, place anywhere between the 2nd and the 5th century, she was still the idea of the Shalabhanjika as someone who was part of the temple ritual was still very, very dominant. At least you see that as in the literary forms, but you don't, as time goes by, she is becoming a motive, right? So you see so many Mughal and even the Ragamala series where you will simply see, so Asaveri, I think, if I recollect right, the Asaveri Ragamala painting is where, you know, there's this beautiful woman who's wearing a angraka and she's standing with her hand, you know, above her head on the tree. Now you see her as a lonely figure, somebody who's in Virahatapa, somebody who's a Virahot-Khandita Nayika and all of that. But we fail to associate that Virahot-Khandita Nayika to the actual performance, right? So the geopolitical scenario in which Shalabhanjika was moving was indeed making her a mere motif, was indeed making her a frozen sculpture. She could just be one of the many decorations that one can put on the walls, but all her ritualistic and esoteric roles within a temple were slowly being forgotten in some sense, one can say. Not just, I won't even say being forgotten. I think it was shifting, it was moving. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's only one of the geopolitical scenarios. So many more.
We do have another interesting question, ma'am. So you speak about time, and these sculptures are a moment in time that have kind of become timeless. So what do you feel, or what is your perception or your understanding of how sculptors perceived time?
I think that's where I began, right? So for me, the sculptors saw the movement in the sculpture. That's why I said it's important for us to be able to see the movement in the sculpture. If we start seeing them as sculptures that are frozen, freezes, we call it poses, right? We say, oh, the Varur Bani, for example, in Bharatanatyam, it's full of poses. Now you are posing not innocuously in the middle of nothing. The pose is part of a long sequence, and then you come to that pose, and then after that you move again into so it is really stitched within a movement. So I think the sculptors would have seen it like that, which is why each sculptor was able to imagine a different moment to freeze, like a photographer really, right? So they would have, their experience would have been with, and like I said, because the sculptors were always trained in Shilpa Shastra, and Shilpa Shastra does not talk about the Shalabhanjika. The only way they would have experienced her is through performance. So I can very confidently say that the sculptor was looking at a performance and he was taking a moment in and he tried to freeze it. I mean, okay, he is also a presumption. Why not a she or they?
Ma'am, while they do that, I have a question for you, if I may be so bold. What do you think was the status of a woman in that epoch, in that era? You talked about Mohenjo-daro, you talked about Harappa, and most of these, and the whole talk today is about dancing women, right? Do you think they were deified? Do you think they were objectified? What do you think? How do you think that civilization or those times perceived women?
There is no one right answer to this. and when we're saying then is a long time. So it's when is that then is the question. But the idea that at any given time, just like in today's society, women were deified. Their position in the society as people who were procreators, as people who were capable of bringing new life into the world, that was looked at with great awe. And as religions and as philosophies were emerging and developing, I think incorporating this natural biological phenomenon and explaining that was a very important part. So women had a huge role to play in the deification, and the idea of worship of nature, worship of and all of that, when it moved to worshipping entities in the more sort of Hindu pantheonic era, the woman worship and the women being worshipped, and then the woman becoming the worshipper, and then the woman being stepping outside of the worship space. All of this was happening at different levels. But having said that, these are all times that were part of a society that was evolving in a sort of tribal to feudal patriarchal world. So there was absolutely no doubt that many of these views on women and women's status and women's position and her role in society and her role in the formation of social family structures was indeed, at least to our eyes today, will seem rather patriarchal. So the answer to that is yes and no.
Ma'am, that was a wonderful, wonderful way to put it, really, because, if you think about it, all reproductive duty, all the species across the board has been given to the female of every species. And I think though that, for a lack of a better word, generation, they knew the significance of that responsibility, if I may call it that. And,
I think we are no different as a society, don't you think? So we are quite the same in the sense that she is still Mata. She's also somebody who can be in this country freely abused, in the public, and then she can also be reified into religious positions.
Very interesting foray. What do you think, really? What do you think that we can take from these that might be contextual to our current situation?
Sorry, what is that again?
What do you think that we can take from those sculptures and from that time that could be contextual to our current times? What can we learn?
See, I think what I can, it'll be a little far-fetched to take all that out of just Shalabhanjika, but I will be bold to say that, going back to Derrida, we can say that the experience is in the now. So if you're judging a woman, make sure your judgment is in the experience and in the now, rather than on notions and constructs and all kinds of other things that govern one's mind, right? So that would be a very useful thing to take out of not just Shalabhanjika, but any idea, right? That that the experience is contingent upon time. So time is now. It's not 2 years before. It's not what your mother told you. It's definitely not futuristic. So stick to now.
Wonderful, ma'am. With your permission, I will bring this session to a close. We can go on forever, and I know that we have a lot of audience here that would like you to go on forever. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talking to us, and you've given us an insight, a glimpse into the past, the present, and perhaps even the future. And really, really appreciate that.
I really want to thank you, and particularly you and your lovely team. It's a wonderful platform, and I thank you particularly, and of course Pramod and the entire team at Wishwas for making this happen. Thank you very much. You're doing a lovely job.